Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. Today, I want to discuss a proposal for Customer Resource Monitor CRD. And as we know, cube state matrix is an agent which collects many metrics, for example, pod matrix, deployment matrix, and customer resource matrix. Currently, we have a customer resource state monitoring feature which collects these metrics. However, this feature have several problems. The first one is that using this customer resource data monitoring feature is not user-friendly. Currently, we have two ways to use this feature, either using customer resource state config with an inline YAML file, or we can use customer resource state config file with an config.yaml file. This file should be mounted or its config map. Another thing is that this feature doesn't support multiple configuration files. For example, for a company with 10 teams, and each team wants to collect customer resource metrics for their own customer resources. And this thing is not possible in current cube state matrix agent. So the goal of this proposal is to provide a better user experience on collecting customer resource metrics. And the proposal is that we want to end the CRD named the customer resource monitor, which contains all the fields from customer resource data.metrics. In this way, it's not a breaking change. It copies all the fields from existing feature. Yeah, so does anyone have some comments? If no, we will continue to the details. Okay, we can continue to the details. So in order to do that, we will have two changes. One is some new flags. Another thing is the new CRD named the Customer Resource Monitor. So you can see we will have these three flags for the Customer Resource Monitor. And for the CRD, currently, I propose to use this group name, kubestatemetric.l. I consider the k8s.l before, but this one needs additional approval. And the kubestatemetric agent is not inside the Kubernetes repo. So I'm not sure whether we can use k8s.l as our group name. Another alternative is ksm.l, but this one has been used by a company, so we cannot use the ksm.l. And the version will be v1 alpha 1 because this API is not stable so far, because we have another ongoing work to use CL to enhance our CR monitoring feature. And the CAN will be customer resource monitor. As you can see, the definition is very simple. It's not creating a new CRD. It just copy everything from our existing feature into this CRD. The customer resource state.metrics is the current customer resource monitoring feature. Yeah, in this way, we can see an example CR. So from the spec, it's copied from the config file. Yeah, and then we will go to on the details on how to watch and reconcile on the customer resource monitor CRs. Yeah, so basically.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah.
Can we include some kind of status to give feedback on whether this monitor is applied correctly?
Oh, got you.
Just like you can use conditions or something like that, just to show like if this failed to reconcile because maybe it's rejected or formatted incorrectly for some reason.
Yeah, so we can add the status to this CR.
Yeah.
Or we can print some logs in the KSM.
I mean, if we can avoid having to look at logs to know that a CR is incorrect, then it's good to have it in a CR.
Okay, we can enter it into the status of this CR.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so in general, the KSM will listen on the events of customer resource monitor CR. And once this event happens, the KSM will list all the customer resource monitor CRs and concatenate them into one config. So this file will have the almost same content with our original flag. So we can see this graph. CRM means customer resource monitor. So it will have an informer per namespace. And once this event happens, it will do two things. First thing, it will end all the new, it will list and end all the customer resource monitors. The next thing, it will delete unused customer resource monitors. And then it will update our customer resource store. After that, it will generate the configuration for node pool. So our KSM will listen on the customer resource CR, and based on this CR, it will select fields from the node pool CR, and then it will generate metrics around the node pool CR. And the migration is very simple. We just need to copy a thing from the customer resource data config file, paste into this CR, and also add the API version, train the candidate name, and also add some labels. So the CUJ critical user journey would be this. So for example, it will have 3 teams: cloud provider, whether it's GKE, AKS, or EKS, and the application platform and the monitoring platform team. So they can use different labels to select the CRs. Yeah, so in general, this design is not creating a new CRD. It just copy our fields into the CRD. Yeah, I think that's almost the basic idea of this proposal. So does anyone have other opinions on it? Or do you have other concerns or questions on this proposal?
I mean, if I may say something, one thing that we need to make sure is that we don't move to CRD before the next major release, because that will be a breaking change for the existing users. And the other thing is that, well, in parallel, there is the effort for CEL, and most likely that's something we would want to integrate to the CRD schema. So like, I'm fine going with one proposal first and merge it on a release branch, but we will need to refine it at some point again in order to include the CEL work, just to make sure that the overall user experience is great and we don't like just patch things on top of existing designs, but we try to think how we could do that better by including both. That's the only way I have.
Yeah, so my plan is to using V1 beta 1 to use CEL. And I will do the auto conversion. So it will convert from the CRD version V1 alpha 1 to V1 beta 1.
Yeah, but since like we will break the users anyway, to me it's better like if we are cautious and we only do that once and they don't have to change much between the versions. I leave the floor to Manuel since he has a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, so I have a couple of questions, but I would like the first two. So if we have two custom resource monitors that, for example, would generate the same metric name or similar, how should that be treated if the config gets applied, like let's say different namespaces?
Yeah, I think this one has a similar issue using the existing feature. If we end multiple namespace, same metrics in the same configuration file, it will have some issues. But I think in this case, we will update the status. So we will say, okay, it has conflicts.
So I think that design should figure out a solution for these conflicts, and maybe one could be having a webhook that is additionally deployed that basically does a dry run of the configuration. Don't want to go too much into details, but I think this is something could be very error prone for users. In particular, if you have like many teams and many teams deploy, let's say, the same type of software, then you could run into these issues that you create, like conflicting configurations. And then kind of moving on to like the second question, which is around a cluster that has role-based access control enabled. So how would you manage access to resources that teams have defined in their custom resource monitor? Let's say there's a new custom resource that they want to monitor, but then State Metrics does not necessarily have access to this custom resource.
Yeah, I think in this case, we will and also permission to the State Metric agent.
But how does it get that? Is that something basically because your idea was here that teams should run this in a self-service manner, so they should be able to create the custom resource monitor in their own namespace, but then it sounds to me like they would need to talk to kind of the owner of State Metrics to get the permissions updated.
Yes, I think you are right. Currently, this thing is not decoupled. It's still, they need to ask the monitoring team to add more permissions. I think it's a good thing because it can go through the privacy review. Maybe.
So
yeah,
I guess what I'm leading to, I think there are more complex scenarios that we need to look into, and ideally we should look also into like decoupling this from State Metrics as a system itself, because I mean, you for example don't want to have like a kind of give State Metrics kind of an admin level access so it can create those on their own if that's desired. So maybe we should look into a pattern similar to what Prometheus and Prometheus Operator does.
Does Prometheus Operator like generate its own roles and role bindings? That seems
it does not, because there is no need to, because everything is static. But if you really want to split away the functionality from State Metrics, then basically you have one system that generates the access and the other system that uses the access.
I think I saw this as a comment in the GitHub issue, and I wrote a response to it. And it's so like as a customer of KSM, I find that like building a config file and like writing it out as YAML in a config map is just like a very unergonomic way to work with like any system in Kubernetes. So like, at least I would hope that like the long-term plan would be to move to a CR and a CRD, because that's so much easier to use.
I also don't agree with extracting the functionality to an external operator, mostly because you're going to have to grant those permissions to that operator to begin with, which are the same permissions that you would be granting here. So no matter what, you're still granting those permissions somewhere.
Or you're having to grant permissions to create permissions, which is essentially like,
Yeah, I don't, that's not super friendly either. I just, like, honestly, I want my KSM just to do the things that I want it to do, and I don't want necessarily to have to install other things in order to unlock core functionality. That doesn't make sense to me.
So I mean, the difference here is like there's a user supplied configuration, and also like, I mean, the metrics endpoint is basically read only, so it's not going to be an issue there. But eventually, kind of, you have one system that eventually gets a large access, and we need to figure out a way to grant this access in a secure way. And that's why separating that is usually a good principle.
isn't that a responsibility of the administrator? Like, whenever we're adding new systems, either the system comes with a role and role binding because it has some static amount of permissions, but if it didn't have any static permissions, and if it was based on the configuration, then it would be my responsibility to think about the configurations I'm making and create the necessary roles.
Yeah,
and I think it's like the only safe way to do it, right? Like any system which can like automatically grant permissions like that is going to have more permissions than it needs.
and if you're not using CRDs, this is a non-issue, right? If you're not watching CRDs, this is a non-issue.
It doesn't. See, it's the same issue whether you use CRDs or YAML configs. You still have to grant those permissions, right?
Sure, but you're separating it. I think that's the main thing, and I don't know, like if from a user experience perspective, kind of you have your custom resource kind of the custom resource monitor in, let's say it's something that gets very common and you have it in your Helm package and you want to deploy that, and suddenly either it fails because the webhook says, okay, you don't have permission, so it's like it doesn't make a smooth deployment. So I'm just thinking, okay, we need to basically look more into how can we resolve like all the RBAC related issues.
So is the idea that you want the webhook to be able to reject a custom resource monitor based on the fact that like your current role bindings don't have access to that object? Because I think what like an acceptable experience to me at least would be I create the custom resource monitor and then the status tells me it was unable to be reconciled correctly because it doesn't have permissions. So it would just tell me like the KSM is using this role and this role doesn't have permissions to this object, and then I see that in the custom resource monitor, and then I would be like, okay, that's something I need to resolve on my own.
Yeah, I mean that's basically something we need to discuss how we want to make that visible to the user. I think like a principle that I like is having like errors visible and not trying to hide them, because otherwise people expect that it worked, but they never look at like the status where you maybe hit that information. And
sure, I think a webhook could work there. I think it's different, or it's a separate issue from separating this system entirely and whether it can create its own permissions.
Yeah, I mean, we need to look into kind of these RBAC related topics, I think, as well as like conflicts between custom resource monitors. If an external operator is something we need. I would like to have like an external operator because it also reduces the amount of code that we have on cube state metrics. And if we, for example, need to evolve CRDs, need to upgrade them, I think this is something that can be treated easier in that external operator. But of course, it's something just basically where if you're like, okay, in the design, we need to talk a little bit more about RBAC and about resource conflicts.
So one thing is like, while I don't agree with the external monitor, there is something to be said about the fact that CRD metrics are kind of in a class of its own, and it extends KSM past its like original scope and design. And in fact, it may make sense to have something like CRD state metrics, right, with all the CRD logic, because CRD metrics possibly have high cardinality, and so you may want to isolate your metric from KSM, which can also have super high cardinality.
I agree with this idea too, because they seem to be like managed by different people at least in the way we're doing it. Like we have a team who's probably more concerned about the state of Kubernetes and all of the core objects, and then we have a team that's like probably exposing the custom stuff as maybe like different people.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe a different
CRD
system.
state metrics may make sense. We may want to just extract the functionality. Like I would be okay with that, right? But an operator to operate like CRD state metrics or cube state metrics or whatever, just I don't like that abstraction personally.
Yeah, if I may chime in, I don't really like the idea of operator as well, because to me, like KSM, there is only one role for it, which is to expose metric, and you don't really need to have something managing the config for it. Like it can just manage its own config. There's no need for an additional layer. And with regard to the discussion of separating custom state metric and cube state metric, to me, we could simplify the code and the user experience to have cube state metric and custom state metric being the same, meaning that every users want to generate metrics out of resources, no matter which resources it is. It can be pods, it can be their own CRD. It doesn't matter. Like what they usually want is to expose metrics out of resources. And so if we were to simplify the project to allow that and make it configurable for every resources, while still providing some default metrics that we already provide today, to kind of have some guidelines on what they need to deploy. To me, that would be the end goal of like, just make it customizable easily for the users, no matter the resources. So I wouldn't even like make the distinction. It would be up to then the admin to deploy their flavor of cube state metric that they want in the namespace they want, essentially.
So, I mean, what you're suggesting is a huge refactoring of KSM though. So the scope, so like the scope of that suggestion is, I mean, like, it feels a little bit like boiling the ocean.
So in terms of refactoring, to me, it's the same as bringing the configuration for custom state metric. The only thing that we would have to migrate is move the existing code that generates the metric into config. That's the only thing that we need to migrate. There's no much rewrite because like we would have the code for custom state metric. It's just like, how do we port that to cube state metric?
To make sure I understood this correct, so are you suggesting that we, for all the core resources that we're currently monitoring, we're moving that out of kind of their packages into configuration?
Yep.
Yes.
Or did I
Exactly.
misunderstand?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. The idea that I have these days is like moving cube state metric as a configuration-based project rather than like having code generating the metrics. So that's one idea that I have. I think like some of the maintainers had it in the past as well, but it's more clear these days with custom state metric that we would need something like that in the future, or that we might need it.
Quick question about that in terms of performances. CubeState metric can be very using a lot of CPU to generate metrics when they have a lot of pods. Moving from code to a configuration, do you see that it can be also performance regression in CubeState metric if everything goes through a configuration?
To me, that wouldn't change much because the code for generating the metrics would be the same. Like the only additional CPU usage that you would have is like just watching the config and then creating whatever like generator that is normally created when you initialize CubeState metric, but this time it would be a bit different. But the current optimization would be the same. And I would rather see it more like I would see it as allowing users to customize CubeState metric more to their needs. So if they don't need a particular metric, they could just like remove it from their configuration. And so it would be like a bit faster even than what it is today and more efficient.
One downside is then you need write permissions to CRDs for regular metrics.
You mean for watching the CR
Yes.
in general?
Yeah, so it changes the RBAC permissions. With
Yeah,
CRDs,
it's just an idea.
Slightly more understandable why we would be expanding permissions, because custom resources are arbitrary, and so the configuration is going to be more complicated, right? Like, whereas well-known Kubernetes types are well-known and therefore don't need as complex configuration.
Yeah, you also don't necessarily need discovery, I feel like, because if there are no config that ask for metrics from CRDs, like you don't have to like launch the process that will do discovery. So it should be fine as well. I don't know. And to me, that's just an idea that we could investigate as well. Part of like all the other ideas that we have on custom state metric.
I think we're going to need a follow-up meeting because we're out of time.
Yep.
Okay.
I think it will make sense to schedule that like maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks until we have settled on what we need to do.
Yeah, I will check the time and send a meeting later.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you everyone for discussing, and thank you for all the comments and suggestions. Yeah, we will review again on this feature.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye.